A man walks into a fertility clinic with a backpack full of explosives, believing he is saving lives by ending them before they begin. A beauty queen texts her intent to kill a toddler, then follows through with chilling precision. A mother cuts an unborn child from her daughter's womb, convinced the baby belongs to her. These are not monsters from fiction. These are real people who walked among us in 2025, and their minds hold secrets far more terrifying than any horror film could conjure. Before we descend into these psychological abysses, I want you to do something. Comment below with one question. What psychological trait scares you most in a killer? Is it their calmness, their logic, their ability to justify the unjustifiable? Your answer might reveal more about human nature than you realize. Now let us begin. The morning of March 14, 2025, began like any other at the Desert Springs Fertility Center in Palm Springs, California. Couples arrived with hope etched into their tired faces, clutching folders of medical records and dreams of children they had not yet met. The waiting room smelled of lavender air freshener and anxiety. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Everything was designed to soothe, to comfort, to promise that life would find a way. Guy Edward Barkes walked through those doors at 9:47 a.m. with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He was 42 years old, clean-shaven, wearing khaki pants and a button-down shirt that looked freshly ironed. Security footage would later show him pausing at the reception desk, offering a polite smile to the woman behind the counter. He asked where the restroom was located. She pointed down the hall. He thanked her. He never made it to the restroom. At 9:52 a.m., Barkes entered the main treatment wing, where embryo storage tanks hummed with liquid nitrogen and microscopes sat ready for the delicate work of creating life. He set his backpack down carefully, as if placing a sleeping infant in a crib. Then he walked back toward the exit with the same measured pace he had entered with. He made it to the parking lot before the explosion tore through the building. 3 staff members died instantly. 7 others suffered injuries ranging from severe burns to traumatic amputations. Thousands of embryos, each one a potential human life suspended in frozen possibility, were destroyed. The blast radius was calculated, precise, designed not for maximum casualties, but for maximum symbolic impact. Barkes had targeted the heart of human reproduction itself. When federal agents arrested him 6 hours later at a motel 17 miles away, he was sitting on the bed watching news coverage of the bombing. He did not resist. He did not run. He simply stood up, placed his hands behind his back, and said something that would echo through courtrooms and psychiatric evaluations for months to come. He said, "I did what was necessary to prevent suffering." This is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because Guy Edward Barkes was not insane in any legal or clinical sense. He was not hearing voices. He was not delusional about the nature of reality. He understood perfectly well that he had killed people and destroyed potential lives. He simply believed, with absolute philosophical conviction, that he had done the right thing. Barkes was a follower of antinatalism, a philosophical position that assigns negative value to birth. But he had taken this philosophy to its most extreme and violent conclusion. In the hundreds of pages of writings found on his laptop, in the manifestos he had posted to obscure forums under various pseudonyms, he laid out his reasoning with chilling clarity. Birth, he wrote, is the original violence. Every human life contains within it the guarantee of suffering, pain, disease, loss, and death. To create a life is to condemn a conscious being to experience all of these inevitabilities without their consent. The unborn cannot choose to exist. Therefore, he argued, preventing birth is not murder but mercy. It is the only truly ethical act in a world built on the foundation of imposed existence. His writings showed no rage, no emotional instability, no signs of the chaotic thinking typically associated with violent extremism. Instead, they demonstrated a cold, methodical logic that built argument upon argument like a prosecutor making a case. He cited philosophers from Schopenhauer to Benneter. He used statistics on human suffering, data on depression rates, studies on chronic pain. He constructed what he believed was an airtight moral framework for his actions. In his mind, the people who died in the bombing were tragic but necessary casualties in a war against existence itself. The embryos he destroyed were not victims but beneficiaries, spared from the burden of consciousness. He saw himself not as a terrorist but as a liberator, freeing potential beings from the prison of life before they could be locked inside it. Would you have seen the warning signs? Could you have predicted that a quiet, articulate man who worked as a data analyst and lived alone in a modest apartment, was capable of such calculated violence? This is the question that haunts everyone who knew him, however peripherally. His co-workers described him as reserved but pleasant. He never missed deadlines. He brought donuts to the office on Fridays. His landlord said he always paid rent on time and kept his apartment immaculate. His few acquaintances from online philosophy forums remembered him as thoughtful and well-read, someone who engaged in debates with patience and intellectual rigor. There were no red flags in the traditional sense. No history of violence. No criminal record. No threatening behavior. The only warning signs existed in the realm of ideas in the gradual radicalization of his philosophical beliefs as he spent years in echo chambers of antinatalist thought, each conversation pushing him further toward the conclusion that action was required. This is what makes Bartkus so psychologically disturbing. He represents a new category of killer, one driven not by emotion but by ideology, not by impulse but by conviction. He did not snap, he did not lose control. He made a choice, calmly and deliberately, based on a moral framework that he had constructed over years of careful thought. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elena Vasquez, who evaluated Bartkus for the prosecution, described him as one of the most unsettling subjects she had ever interviewed. He showed no remorse, she noted in her report. Not because he lacked empathy, but because he genuinely believed he had acted ethically. He could articulate the pain his victims' families felt. He could acknowledge the horror of his actions from their perspective. He simply disagreed with their moral framework. During one evaluation session, Dr. Vasquez asked him if he felt any guilt about the 3 people who died. Bartkus paused for a long moment, then responded with a question of his own. Do you feel guilt when you prevent someone from being born by using contraception? When she said no, he nodded and said, Then you understand my position. I simply extended the timeline. This is the logic of philosophical extremism taken to its ultimate conclusion. Bartkus had created a moral universe in which the greatest good was the prevention of existence, and within that universe his actions made perfect sense. The fact that this universe was fundamentally incompatible with the values that hold human society together did not concern him. He had transcended, in his own mind, the limitations of conventional morality. The trial became a battleground not just of legal arguments but of philosophical ones. Bartkus's defense team, faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, attempted to argue that his beliefs constituted a form of mental illness, a delusional disorder that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. But the prosecution's psychiatric experts testified that Bartkus was fully competent, that he understood both the nature of his actions and their consequences, and that philosophical conviction, no matter how extreme, does not constitute legal insanity. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. Bartkus showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression neutral. At sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Bartkus stood and spoke for 7 minutes without notes. He expressed sympathy for the families of his victims. He acknowledged their pain. Then he said that future generations would understand his actions, that history would vindicate him, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward the recognition that existence itself is the problem. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But here is what keeps psychologists and law enforcement officials awake at night. Bartkus is not unique. His writings have been shared thousands of times on antinatalist forums. He has received letters of support from people around the world who view him as a martyr. There are others out there sitting in quiet apartments, working ordinary jobs, constructing the same logical frameworks that led Bartkus to walk into a fertility clinic with a bomb. The question is not whether there will be another Guy Edward Bartkus. The question is when and where and how many people will die before we figure out how to identify and intervene with individuals who have weaponized philosophy itself. Do you think someone can be evil if they genuinely believe they are doing good? This is the moral paradox at the heart of the Bartkus case, and it has no easy answer. October 26, 1965. Indianapolis, Indiana. A 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens died in the basement of a house on New York Street. The official cause of death was brain hemorrhage and shock induced by extensive injuries. But that clinical language cannot capture the true horror of what happened to Sylvia in the 3 months before her death. She was tortured, systematically, repeatedly, by multiple people. And the architect of that torture was a 37-year-old woman named Gertrude Banishevsky. You might wonder why we are discussing a case from 1965 in an article about 2025. The answer is both simple and deeply troubling. Gertrude Banishevsky has become relevant again. In the first 4 months of 2025, searches for her name increased by 340%. True crime podcasts have dedicated entire seasons to analyzing her psychology. Academic papers are being published, examining her case as a model for understanding group-based violence. She has become, 6 decades after her crime, a subject of renewed fascination and horror. But more importantly, psychologists are now recognizing patterns in her behavior that help explain modern cases of collective abuse. From torture in detention facilities to hazing deaths to cases of familial sadism that continue to emerge with disturbing regularity. Gertrude Banishevsky, it turns out, created a blueprint for how ordinary people can be transformed into torturers. Let us return to 1965 and understand what happened in that house. Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny were left in Gertrude's care by their parents, carnival workers, who needed someone to watch their daughters while they traveled for work. They paid Gertrude $20 a week. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Gertrude had 7 children of her own and experience managing a household. The Likens' parents had no reason to suspect that they were leaving their daughters in the hands of someone who would orchestrate one of the most brutal torture murders in American history. The abuse began gradually. Gertrude was struggling financially, dealing with the stress of single motherhood, suffering from depression and chronic pain. When the Likens' parents were late with a payment, she took her frustration out on Sylvia. A slap, a shove, verbal abuse. Nothing that would have seemed to an outside observer beyond the realm of harsh discipline. But then something shifted. Gertrude began to focus her rage specifically on Sylvia, singling her out for increasingly severe punishments. She accused Sylvia of being promiscuous, of being a bad influence, of deserving punishment. And here is where the psychology becomes truly disturbing. She began to recruit others into the abuse. First, her own children, then neighborhood kids who hung around the house. She created an environment in which torturing Sylvia became normalized, even encouraged. She gave permission for violence. She modeled cruelty. She framed the abuse as justified punishment for Sylvia's supposed moral failings. The torture escalated over weeks and months. Sylvia was beaten with paddles, belts, and fists. She was burned with cigarettes. She was forced to insert a glass bottle into herself while the other children watched. She was tied up in the basement and denied food. Words were carved into her stomach with a heated needle. "I am a prostitute and proud of it." Multiple children participated in this abuse. Some were Gertrude's own offspring. Others were neighborhood kids, some as young as 10 years old. They took turns inflicting pain. They competed for Gertrude's approval by devising new torments. They became, under her guidance, a collective instrument of sadism. This is what makes Gertrude Banishevsky so psychologically significant. She did not act alone. She created a system of abuse in which multiple people participated, each one feeding off the other's cruelty, each one emboldened by the group dynamic. She demonstrated how a single individual with authoritarian tendencies and sadistic impulses can transform a group of otherwise ordinary people into torturers. Modern psychologists studying the case have identified several key mechanisms that Gertrude employed, often unconsciously, to create this environment of collective violence. First, she established herself as an unquestioned authority figure. Her word was law in that house. Children who questioned her were punished. Those who obeyed were rewarded with approval and inclusion. She created a hierarchy in which compliance with her demands, no matter how cruel, was the path to safety and acceptance. Second, she systematically dehumanized Sylvia. She referred to her as trash, as worthless, as deserving of punishment. She created a narrative in which Sylvia was fundamentally different from the other children, morally inferior, not fully human. This dehumanization made it psychologically easier for the other children to inflict pain without feeling empathy or guilt. Third, she normalized the violence through gradual escalation. The abuse did not begin with the worst atrocities. It started small and increased incrementally, each new level of cruelty becoming the baseline for the next. This gradual progression prevented the other children from experiencing a sudden moral shock that might have prompted them to resist or report the abuse. Fourth, she created a sense of collective responsibility that paradoxically reduced individual guilt. When everyone is participating in the abuse, no single person feels fully responsible. The diffusion of responsibility that occurs in group settings allowed the children to participate in acts they likely would never have committed alone. Fifth, she isolated Sylvia from any potential sources of help. Sylvia was kept out of school. She was prevented from contacting her parents. She was confined to the house and basement. This isolation ensured that no outside authority could intervene, and that Sylvia herself could not escape or seek help. These mechanisms, identified through analysis of the Banashevsky case, appear again and again in modern instances of group-based torture and abuse. They show up in military detention facilities where guards abuse prisoners. They appear in fraternity hazing rituals that turn deadly. They emerge in families where one child is singled out for systematic abuse while siblings participate or stand by. The Banashevsky case provides a roadmap for understanding how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty when placed in certain social and psychological conditions. When Sylvia finally died on October 26, 1965, her body bore evidence of prolonged torture. She had burns, bruises, and lacerations covering most of her body. She was malnourished and dehydrated. The words carved into her stomach were infected. She had been beaten so severely that her brain had hemorrhaged. Gertrude called the police and claimed that Sylvia had been attacked by a gang of boys, but the story quickly fell apart. The children in the house, when questioned separately, began to reveal what had really happened. The full scope of the horror emerged piece by piece. Gertrude Banashevsky was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Several of the children who participated in the abuse were also convicted, though most received lighter sentences due to their ages. Gertrude served 20 years before being paroled in 1985, a decision that sparked outrage and protests. She died in 1990 at the age of 61. But her legacy lives on in the psychological literature and in the renewed interest her case has generated in 2025. Researchers are using her case to develop better screening tools for identifying individuals with the potential to orchestrate group-based abuse. Law enforcement agencies are studying the patterns of escalation to recognize warning signs earlier. Child protection services are examining how isolation and dehumanization create conditions for extreme abuse. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is the same question that applies to so many instances of collective violence. How do ordinary people become torturers? The children who participated in Sylvia's abuse were not, by all accounts, inherently evil. They were products of their environment, shaped by the authoritarian influence of an adult who gave them permission to act on their worst impulses. Would you have participated if you had been one of those children? Would you have resisted? Would you have reported the abuse? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the truth is that most people, under the right conditions, are capable of cruelty they would never have imagined themselves committing. The Banashevsky case forces us to confront the darkness that exists not just in individual psychopaths, but in the social dynamics that can transform groups of ordinary people into instruments of torture. It shows us that evil is not always a solitary phenomenon. Sometimes it is collective, emergent, created through the interaction of authority, dehumanization, and group dynamics. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing lesson of all. She was crowned Miss Rodeo Oregon in 2021. Photographs from the pageant show a young woman with a radiant smile, wearing a sequined Western outfit and a sparkling tiara. She looked like the embodiment of wholesome American beauty, the kind of person you would trust to babysit your children or teach Sunday school. Trinity Pogue was 23 years old when she sent a text message that would later be used as evidence in a murder trial. The message, sent to a friend on January 8, 2025, was brief and chilling. "I'm going to kill him." 3 weeks later, on January 29th, 2-year-old Colton Lee was dead. The case of Trinity Pogue represents a particular type of psychological horror, the killer who hides behind a facade of beauty, charm, and normalcy. She was not a stranger lurking in shadows. She was the girlfriend of Colton's father, a woman who had been entrusted with the care of a vulnerable child. She was someone who smiled for cameras and waved at crowds and presented herself as the picture of innocence. And prosecutors allege that she planned and executed the murder of a toddler with cold, calculated precision. The details of Colton's death are difficult to recount. On the evening of January 29th, emergency services received a call from the home where Trinity lived with her boyfriend and his son. Trinity reported that Colton was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find the child in cardiac arrest. He was rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The initial explanation was that Colton had suffered some kind of medical emergency, perhaps a seizure or an undiagnosed condition, but the autopsy revealed a different story. Colton had died from blunt force trauma to the head and abdomen. His injuries were consistent with being beaten, not with any natural medical event. The medical examiner determined that the injuries had been inflicted within hours of his death. Investigators began to focus on Trinity. She had been alone with Colton when the injuries occurred. Her story about what happened that evening contained inconsistencies. And then, during a search of her phone records, they found the text message sent 3 weeks earlier, "I'm going to kill him." The prosecution's theory of the case is that Trinity resented Colton's presence in her life. She wanted a relationship with his father without the complications of a young child. She saw Colton as an obstacle to the life she wanted, and so she decided to remove that obstacle. But here is what makes this case psychologically disturbing. The planning. The text message sent 3 weeks before the murder suggests premeditation, a period of time during which Trinity thought about killing a 2-year-old child and made the conscious decision to follow through. This was not a moment of rage or a loss of control. This was, if the prosecution's theory is correct, a calculated decision made over weeks. Trinity's defense attorneys have argued that the text message was taken out of context, that it was an expression of frustration rather than a genuine threat, that Trinity loved Colton and would never have harmed him. They have suggested that the injuries could have been accidental, the result of a fall or some other mishap that Trinity panicked about and failed to report immediately. But the prosecution has painted a different picture. They have presented evidence of Trinity's resentment toward Colton, including text messages to friends complaining about having to care for him. They have highlighted her lack of emotional response when told of his death, the absence of tears or visible grief. They have argued that her beauty queen persona was a mask, a carefully constructed facade that hid a capacity for cold-blooded violence. The psychological profile that emerges from the evidence is one of narcissism and resentment displacement. Trinity, according to forensic psychologists who have analyzed the case, appears to have had an inflated sense of her own importance and a deep need for admiration and attention. The presence of a young child in her relationship interfered with her ability to be the center of attention. Colton's needs competed with her own desires. In individuals with narcissistic personality traits, this kind of competition can generate intense resentment. The child becomes not a person with inherent value but an obstacle, an inconvenience, something to be removed. The narcissist's inability to empathize with others' needs and feelings makes it psychologically possible to view even a toddler as an enemy rather than a vulnerable human being deserving of protection. There is also the element of maternal hostility, a phenomenon that occurs when a woman in a caregiving role toward a child develops feelings of anger and resentment rather than nurturing attachment. This can happen for various reasons: stress, mental illness, personality disorders, or simply a fundamental mismatch between the person's psychological makeup and the demands of caregiving. In Trinity's case, if the prosecution's theory is correct, maternal hostility combined with narcissistic traits created a deadly combination. She was placed in a caregiving role she did not want, with a child she resented, and her response was not to remove herself from the situation, but to remove the child. What makes this particularly chilling is the contrast between Trinity's public persona and her alleged private actions. She was a beauty queen, someone who had won competitions based on her appearance, poise, and ability to present herself as an ideal. She knew how to smile for cameras, how to charm judges, how to project an image of perfection. This ability to maintain a facade is characteristic of certain types of killers, particularly those with narcissistic or antisocial traits. They understand social expectations and can mimic appropriate emotions and behaviors, but beneath the surface they lack genuine empathy or moral constraints. They are actors playing a role, and the role they play is that of a normal, likable person. The trial, which began in March 2025, has captivated public attention precisely because of this contrast. Courtroom observers have noted Trinity's appearance, always well-dressed, hair and makeup perfect, maintaining a calm and composed demeanor. She looks, even now, like someone who should be on a magazine cover rather than in a defendant's chair facing murder charges. This creates a cognitive dissonance for observers. We want to believe that killers look like monsters, that we could identify them by their appearance or demeanor. But Trinity Pogue, if guilty, demonstrates that evil can wear a tiara and a smile. It can wave at crowds and pose for photographs. It can hide behind beauty and charm. The jury has heard testimony from forensic pathologists about Colton's injuries, from investigators about the text message, from friends about Trinity's complaints regarding the child. They have seen photographs of Colton, a smiling toddler with his whole life ahead of him. They have watched Trinity sit calmly at the defense table, occasionally whispering to her attorneys, showing little visible emotion. As of this writing, the trial is ongoing. The jury has not yet reached a verdict. But regardless of the outcome, the case has already left its mark on the public consciousness. It has forced us to confront the uncomfortable reality that danger can come from the most unexpected sources, that the people we trust with our children might be hiding darkness behind their smiles. Would you have trusted Trinity Pogue to care for your child? Would you have seen any warning signs? Or would you, like Colton's father, have been deceived by the beauty queen facade? These are the questions that make this case so psychologically disturbing. Because the answer for most of us is that we would not have known. We would have seen what Trinity wanted us to see, a beautiful, charming young woman who seemed perfectly normal. We would have missed the resentment, the narcissism, the capacity for violence that allegedly lurked beneath the surface. And that is perhaps the most terrifying realization of all, that we cannot always tell who is dangerous, that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes it wears a crown and smiles for the camera. The 911 call came in at 3:47 a.m. on February 12, 2025. A woman's voice, calm and measured, reported that her 14-month-old daughter was not breathing. Paramedics arrived at the modest home in a quiet California suburb within 6 minutes. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The child, whom we will call Tilly to protect what little dignity remains in this story, was lying on a bedroom floor. She was emaciated, her tiny body showing signs of severe malnutrition. She had bruises in various stages of healing covering her arms, legs, and torso. There were burns on her feet. Her skull showed evidence of multiple impacts. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The parents, a married couple in their late 20s, were arrested within hours. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of abuse so systematic, so prolonged, and so deliberately cruel that even experienced child abuse investigators struggled to comprehend it. This was not neglect. This was not a parent losing control in a moment of frustration. This was ritualized torture of an infant, carried out over months, with both parents participating and neither one stopping. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Tilly's suffering. She had multiple healed fractures, indicating that she had been injured repeatedly over an extended period. She had internal injuries consistent with being struck in the abdomen. She had burns that appeared to have been inflicted with cigarettes or other heated objects. She was severely underweight, suggesting prolonged malnutrition or deliberate starvation. The medical examiner estimated that Tilly had been subjected to abuse for at least 6 months before her death, possibly longer. She had lived half of her short life in a state of constant pain and fear. Investigators found evidence in the home that painted a picture of calculated cruelty. There were text messages between the parents discussing the abuse, treating it as if it were a shared project rather than a crime. There were photographs on their phones showing Tilly's injuries, taken not out of concern but apparently as documentation or even trophies. The psychology of this case is deeply disturbing because it involves 2 people, not one. Sadistic parenting is rare enough when it involves a single perpetrator. But when both parents participate in the systematic torture of their own child, it suggests a folie à deux, a shared psychosis or moral collapse that is almost impossible to comprehend. How do 2 people, both of whom presumably had some capacity for empathy at some point in their lives, come to torture their infant daughter together? What psychological mechanisms allow them to inflict pain on a helpless child day after day, week after week, month after month, without one of them breaking the cycle and seeking help? Forensic psychologists examining the case have identified several factors that may have contributed to this shared sadism. First, there appears to have been a dynamic of mutual reinforcement. Each parent's cruelty emboldened the other. When one inflicted pain, the other did not intervene or express horror, but instead participated or encouraged. This created a feedback loop in which the abuse escalated because neither parent served as a brake on the other's worst impulses. Second, there was evidence of learned violence in both parents' backgrounds. Both had experienced abuse as children. Both had grown up in environments where violence was normalized. This does not excuse their actions, but it helps explain how they might have developed the capacity to inflict similar violence on their own child. Third, there was a complete collapse of empathy. Empathy is what prevents most people from harming others, especially vulnerable others like children. It is the ability to imagine another person's suffering and to be moved by that imagining. In the case of Tilly's parents, this capacity appears to have been absent or suppressed to the point of non-functionality. Fourth, there was a process of dehumanization. The text messages between the parents referred to Tilly in derogatory terms, treating her as an object or an annoyance rather than as a human being with feelings and needs. This linguistic dehumanization made it psychologically easier to inflict pain without experiencing guilt or remorse. The question that haunts everyone who learns about this case is, why did no one notice? Tilly was 14 months old when she died. She had presumably been seen by doctors, by family members, by neighbors. How did her suffering go undetected for so long? The answer is that the parents were careful. They kept Tilly isolated. They did not take her to regular pediatric appointments. They avoided situations where her injuries might be noticed. They created a bubble of secrecy around their home, ensuring that no outside eyes could see what was happening behind closed doors. This isolation is a common feature in cases of severe child abuse. Abusive parents understand, at some level, that what they are doing is wrong and would be stopped if discovered. So they take steps to prevent discovery. They keep the child home from school. They avoid medical care. They cut off contact with family members who might ask questions. They create a prison in which the child is trapped with no possibility of rescue. The trial of Tilly's parents began in April 2025. The prosecution presented evidence that was so disturbing that several jurors were seen crying during testimony. The defense attempted to argue that both parents suffered from mental illness, that they were not fully responsible for their actions due to psychological impairment. But psychiatric evaluations found both parents competent to stand trial. They understood the nature of their actions. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. They simply chose to do it anyway. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. Both parents were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But no sentence can undo what was done to Tilly. No punishment can restore the life that was taken from her or erase the suffering she endured. She lived 14 months on this earth, and at least half of that time was spent in pain and fear at the hands of the two people who should have protected her above all others. The case has prompted calls for reform in child protection systems. How can we better identify children at risk? How can we intervene earlier? How can we prevent cases like Tilly's from happening in the first place? These are important questions, but they miss the deeper psychological horror at the heart of this case. The real question is not about systems or policies. The real question is about human nature itself. How is it possible for parents to torture their own child? What has to break inside a person for them to become capable of such cruelty? The answer is that we do not fully know. We can identify risk factors and psychological mechanisms. We can point to childhood trauma, personality disorders, empathy deficits, and moral collapse. But at the end of the day, there remains something fundamentally incomprehensible about the deliberate torture of an infant by the people who brought her into the world. This incomprehensibility is itself disturbing. We want to believe that we can understand evil, that we can explain it and therefore predict and prevent it. But cases like Tilly's remind us that some acts are so far beyond the bounds of normal human behavior that they resist explanation. They exist in a realm of darkness that most of us cannot fully comprehend because to comprehend it would require us to imagine ourselves capable of the same acts. And that is a place most of us cannot go. The final case we will examine is perhaps the most psychologically complex and disturbing of all. It involves a mother, a pregnant daughter, and an act of violence so extreme that it seems to belong to horror fiction rather than reality. On March 3, 2025, Rebecca Park, a 19-year-old college student, was reported missing by her roommate. Rebecca was 8 months pregnant, due to give birth in just a few weeks. She had last been seen leaving campus to visit her mother for the weekend. When police went to the mother's home to investigate, they found Rebecca's body in the basement. She had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. But that was not the most horrifying discovery. Rebecca's abdomen had been cut open. The baby had been removed from her womb. The mother, whose name has been withheld due to ongoing legal proceedings, was found in an upstairs bedroom with the infant. She had cleaned the baby, wrapped it in blankets, and was holding it as if it were her own child. When police entered the room, she looked up at them and said, "My baby is finally here." The infant, miraculously, was alive. Emergency medical personnel rushed the newborn to the hospital, where doctors determined that despite the traumatic circumstances of the birth, the baby appeared to be healthy. The child was placed in protective custody and later adopted by a family member. The mother was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. The psychiatric evaluation that followed revealed a woman suffering from severe delusional disorder with maternal psychosis. She believed, genuinely and completely, that Rebecca's baby was actually her own child. She had convinced herself that she was pregnant. Despite being physically incapable of pregnancy due to a hysterectomy years earlier, she had prepared a nursery in her home. She had bought baby clothes and supplies. She had told friends and neighbors that she was expecting. When Rebecca became pregnant, the mother's delusion intensified. She began to believe that Rebecca was carrying her baby, that the child in Rebecca's womb somehow belonged to her. This belief was not metaphorical or symbolic. She literally believed that the baby was hers and that Rebecca was merely the vessel carrying it. This is a rare but documented psychological phenomenon called delusional pregnancy or pseudopsoriasis when combined with psychotic features. The individual becomes convinced that they are pregnant or that a baby belongs to them, despite all evidence to the contrary. In extreme cases, this delusion can lead to violence as the delusional individual attempts to obtain the baby they believe is rightfully theirs. But what makes this case particularly disturbing is the relationship between perpetrator and victim. This was not a stranger abducting a pregnant woman. This was a mother killing her own daughter to take her grandchild. The psychology of maternal violence toward adult children is complex and poorly understood. We have frameworks for understanding mothers who harm their young children, whether through abuse, neglect, or infanticide. But mothers who kill their adult offspring represent a different category of violence, one that violates our deepest assumptions about maternal bonds. In this case, the mother's delusion appears to have created a complete identity fusion between herself and the unborn child. She did not see the baby as her grandchild, a separate individual with its own identity and relationships. She saw it as an extension of herself, as her own baby that happened to be growing inside someone else's body. This delusional ownership transformed Rebecca from a daughter into an obstacle. The mother's psychotic thinking could not accommodate the reality that Rebecca was the baby's mother. Instead, Rebecca became, in the mother's mind, a thief who was stealing her baby. The violence that followed was, from the mother's delusional perspective, an act of reclamation rather than murder. Forensic psychologists have noted that this case shares features with other instances of womb violence, a category of crime in which pregnant women are killed and their babies taken. These cases are rare but tend to follow similar patterns. The perpetrator is usually a woman who desperately wants a baby, either due to infertility, pregnancy loss, or psychological need. She identifies a pregnant woman as a target. She befriends or gains access to the victim. Then, at a moment when the pregnancy is far enough along for the baby to survive, she kills the mother and takes the child. What makes this case unique is the familial relationship. Most womb violence cases involve strangers or acquaintances. The perpetrator targets someone she does not have a close relationship with, making it psychologically easier to dehumanize the victim. But in this case, the perpetrator was killing her own daughter, someone she had raised and presumably loved. This suggests that the mother's psychosis was so severe that it completely overrode her maternal attachment to Rebecca. The delusion was stronger than the bond. The need to possess the baby was more powerful than the love for her daughter. The trial has been complicated by questions of competency and sanity. The mother's delusion is so profound that her defense attorneys have argued she was legally insane at the time of the crime, unable to understand the wrongfulness of her actions because her perception of reality was so distorted. Psychiatric experts for the prosecution have countered that while the mother was delusional about the baby's identity, she understood that killing Rebecca was wrong. She attempted to hide the crime. She cleaned up evidence. She had a plan for what to do with the baby after taking it. These actions, they argue, demonstrate that she retained enough contact with reality to know she was committing a crime. The jury will have to decide whether the mother's delusion was so complete that it negated her criminal responsibility, or whether she retained enough awareness to be held accountable for her actions. But regardless of the legal outcome, the psychological horror of this case remains. A mother killed her daughter and cut a baby from her womb because love became entitlement, because maternal feeling twisted into possessive delusion, because the boundaries between self and other collapsed so completely that murder seemed like an act of reclamation. This is the darkest edge of maternal psychology, the place where nurturing instinct becomes consuming obsession, where the desire to protect and possess a child overrides all other considerations, including the life of one's own offspring. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of maternal bonds. We idealize motherhood, treating it as inherently selfless and nurturing. But cases like this remind us that maternal feelings can become pathological, that the same instincts that drive mothers to protect their children can, under certain conditions, drive them to commit unspeakable acts. The baby, now several months old, is being raised by a family member who has been granted permanent custody. The child will grow up knowing the circumstances of their birth, knowing that their mother was killed by their grandmother, knowing that they were literally cut from their mother's body. The psychological impact of this knowledge is impossible to predict, but it will undoubtedly shape the child's understanding of family, safety, and identity. And Rebecca Park, a 19-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, is gone. She will never hold her baby, never watch the child grow, never experience the motherhood she was preparing for. She was killed by the person who gave her life, in an act of violence so extreme that it defies comprehension. This is the final and perhaps most disturbing lesson of this case, that the people closest to us, the ones we trust most completely, can sometimes be the most dangerous. That love can become twisted into something monstrous. That the bonds that should protect us can, under certain conditions, become the instruments of our destruction. We have journeyed through 5 cases that represent the darkest corners of human psychology in 2025. A man who bombed a fertility clinic because he believed existence itself was immoral. A woman from decades past whose blueprint for group sadism continues to echo in modern cases of collective violence. A beauty queen accused of planning and executing the murder of a toddler. Parents who systematically tortured their infant daughter to death. A mother who killed her pregnant daughter to steal the baby from her womb. These are not monsters from fiction. They are real people who walked among us, who held jobs and maintained relationships and presented themselves as normal members of society. They are proof that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides behind philosophy, behind beauty, behind the facade of family, behind the mask of maternal love. The question that connects all these cases is the same question that has haunted humanity since we first began to contemplate our own capacity for cruelty. What makes someone capable of such acts? Is it mental illness, personality disorder, childhood trauma, ideological extremism, or something else entirely? The answer is that it is all of these things, and none of them. Each case is unique, each perpetrator driven by a different combination of psychological factors. But they all share one common element: a fundamental break with the empathy and moral constraints that prevent most people from harming others. Understanding these cases does not make them less disturbing. If anything, the more we learn about the psychology of killers like these, the more unsettling they become. Because understanding reveals that the line between normal and monstrous is thinner than we want to believe, that under certain conditions, ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary cruelty. As we move forward through 2025 and beyond, these cases will continue to be studied, analyzed, and discussed. They will inform our understanding of criminal psychology, our approaches to prevention and intervention, our legal and ethical frameworks for dealing with extreme violence. But they will also continue to haunt us, to disturb our sleep, to make us question our assumptions about human nature and the people around us. Because the most terrifying truth is this: we cannot always tell who is dangerous. We cannot always predict who will snap, who will plan, who will kill. The person sitting next to you on the bus, the neighbor who waves hello, the family member you trust with your children, any of them could be hiding darkness behind their eyes. And that uncertainty, that inability to ever be completely sure who is safe and who is dangerous, is perhaps the most disturbing psychological reality of all. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you become more vigilant, more suspicious, more afraid? Or will you choose to trust, to believe in the fundamental goodness of most people, while remaining aware that evil exists and sometimes wears a familiar face? The choice is yours, but you will never forget the stories you have read here. They will stay with you, lurking in the back of your mind, reminding you that the world contains horrors beyond imagination and that sometimes those horrors come from the people we least expect. Sleep well. If you can,